Zora Neale Hurston was a brave African-American folklorist and anthropologist who studied culturally intriguing and provocative topics for her time period, comparatively to her male and female colleagues of the 1930s. Hurston's anthropological research allowed for many controversial and feminist cultural topics for a black woman of this time period, even as an educated woman. Hurston was born on January 7, 1891, in Natasuga, Alabama. Her family moved to Eatonville, Florida when she was a toddler, which is where the beginning of her life was heavily influenced. Both of her parents had previously been American slaves before moving to Florida with Hurston. Her father, a Baptist preacher, and her mother died when Hurston was fairly young. Hurston was protected from the racism growing up and didn't become aware of racism until her late teens and more so in college. Hurston obtained her associate's degree at Howard University, then transferred to Bernard College in New York, where she was the very first African-American student to graduate. She was accepted for a fellowship grant to continue research where she grew up in Florida. To understand the stories and culture of the region, as well as the voodoo experiences in Haitian and Jamaican culture. She went on to study at Columbia University to work with Franz Boas and female anthropologists studying under Boas, such as Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. Hurston didn't continue in academia after some time at Columbia because of her interests with storytelling, activism with the Harlem Renaissance, and mostly because of her style of ethnographic research and how it didn't align with what people expected of her. Hurston's academic accomplishments were very influential, and her involvement with activism of the Harlem Renaissance is extremely important for the African American movement of popular culture and awareness. Hurston was known for her creative publishings on her interpretation of the experience of a black woman growing up in all-white communities, which carries over into her experience in academia, having all-white professors and colleagues. Her most famous published books were Mules and Men and Their Eyes Were Watching God, which used important ethnographic and anthropological approaches to understand the cultural contexts and oral histories that coincided with these cultures. Hurston was known to fully engross herself in a culture or practice to understand it, to participate alongside. These unconventional approaches are noticeably ahead of her time, but have become more understandable to today's field of anthropology. My favorite book by Hurston was called Sweat, a beautifully composed short story written about an African-American couple where the woman was mistreated, abused, and financially taken advantage of. This story showed the strength of the African-American woman through all of the trauma she encountered after being married. This piece opened up a new perspective from her literature, especially when her oppressive background was accounted for. She received backlash from the African-American community from this piece. Hurston used various anthropological and ethnographic methods that strayed from the normative and accepted approaches acknowledged by her mentors and fellow students. Much of these approaches stemmed from her own personal oppressive experiences throughout her life, which then she applied to the research she executed on the alienation of other cultures. This approach inevitably pushed Hurston out of the world of academia and into folklore studies of African American cultures. It is important to understand that Zora Neale Hurston came from a segregated and oppressive upbringing compared to her colleagues and professors, and how this can shape an individual's personal interests and focus in ethnographic research. Due to her personal community and cultural experiences having felt extreme alienation and othering at times, this posed for a soft spot for Hurston to research many cultures that had felt misunderstood to the Western and ethnocentric eye. Hurston published many works while she was alive, and her work continued to be published after her death in 1960. How It Feels to Be Colored Me was a piece written describing her upbringing in an African American neighborhood in Florida and her oppressive experiences alongside. Tell My Horse, Voodoo in Life in Jamaica and Haiti, and Their Eyes Were Watching God were two very well-known pieces of literature that came from her ethnographic studies in Haiti and Jamaica from her fellowship research. While Franz Boas encouraged Hurston's folklore, her open-minded and culturally inclusive style of observation was even too exotic for him at times. She felt like an outcast in the world of academia and in her everyday life, since she was often one of the only African American students in her classes and community. We have to keep in mind that the time period she lived in was still so behind in terms of civil rights. These experiences influenced Hurston to use inclusiveness in her studies to help people understand that primitive peoples didn't exist anymore, that everyone's personal styles of ritual, religion, expression, storytelling were all valid and just as current as the next society. Much of Zora's folkloric research stems from understanding the misconception of the idea of primitive culture still being a valid idea during her academic studies. Whether it was the oral histories of Eatonville, Florida, where she grew up, the activism literature she wrote for the pop culture revolution of the Harlem Renaissance in New York, or the voodoo practices in Jamaica and Haiti, Hurston wanted to gather research on oppressed cultures as well as misunderstood and misrepresented cultures to give a voice to a so-called primitive people. Some of the most important aspects of her focus in anthropology were to analyze cultures in terms of their own perspectives versus the Western ethnocentric method most often used, to dissect a culture with the emic perspective, to prove that primitive ideas weren't still a valid way to describe a community other than your own just because you are unfamiliar with their cultural ways of living or because you disagree with their lifestyle. Much of her theoretical context came from oral histories and folklore recording, specifically centered around African American culture. She would take in these cultural perspectives and stories from so-called primitive peoples and even immerse herself in their cultural and religious rituals to express to outsiders how normal and understandable they really are, if seen through a culturally relative perspective. Hurston was very aware that she was always having to remain reliant upon her white advisors, peers, and institutions for financial help and accreditation. This shaped much of the direction she was allowed to go theoretically, causing her to continuously feel constrained and inevitably leading her to the choice of leaving the institutions and which made her feel this way. When I think of the cultural context that Zora used in her literature work and anthropological studies, I think of the segregated upbringing she came from and how that directly impacted her and her community, and how that transferred over into her focuses and research. She used her cultural influences from Florida, New York, Jamaica, Haiti, etc., to help mold her outlook on the emic view of anthropological participant observation and studies. She understood that there was a more personable way to involve yourself inside a study and become a part of a culture, rather than studying it as an outsider and putting boundaries on the work being done. This is also a way to gain the respect and trust of the cultures being studied. These overly inclusive and lenient forms of ethnography were too extreme and different for the people of this time period, including her mentors. The strain on her ethnographic style eventually pushed her out of the academic world in anthropology and into journalism and writing books. While she still worked on her own forms of anthropological research, she didn't do it under academic institutions, nor did she benefit from fellowship grant funding once choosing to leave academia. Instead, she chose to carry out the rest of her life by her own rules and methods of ethnographic research and continuously was poor with short-lived jobs to get her by. These concepts for ethnography were considered to be untraditional and unaccepted for the time period in which she studied and performed research. Analyzing these theoretical and cultural contexts in terms of the influential feminist anthropologists that used them first, before it was accepted into anthropological form, is important to understand to realize the dangers that these anthropologists were putting themselves in order to perform quality ethnographic research for the public. After performing the research for this project, many insights have come forth in regards to the field of anthropology as a whole, as well as the important works of Hurston herself, in terms of culturally feminist methods for her time period. By using forms of literature review, document analyses, as well as the overviewing of Hurston's personal cultural research and folklore, this helped to better understand the importance of her approaches and how influential Zora Neale Hurston was for the African American community as well as anthropology as a whole.